Formerly homeless, what's the scariest thing you've seen on the streets? Story 1. In my early 20s, after running out of money, I made the not-so-wise decision to sleep in my car. For several weeks, I parked in a small cul-de-sac, which I thought was mostly office space, so I wasn't taking anyone's designated parking spot. My days were long and tiring, so I usually slept soundly through the night. One night, however, I woke up feeling anxious for no apparent reason. Looking up, I noticed a softly illuminated window above me, the warm light reminiscent of a bedside lamp in a cozy home. As I tried to calm my nerves, I fumbled for my keys, thinking I'd better spend the rest of the night at a nearby McDonald's. That's when I saw him, a man standing still, watching me from a short distance away. He didn't knock on my window or try to speak, he just stood there, staring. My heart raced as I quickly started the car and drove away from the cul-de-sac. The most unsettling part wasn't just that he could have harmed or robbed me, but the chilling realization that he might have been watching me every night, and I had been too exhausted to notice. Story 2. I was working in a mountain town, juggling 2 jobs, yet still unable to afford rent. As a result, I ended up living in a tent just outside of town. One night after work, I was particularly exhausted and a bit drunk. My friend and I, often alone after closing, would stay late, and the bar was essentially ours to enjoy. That night, I left the bar around 2 a.m. and began the hour-and-a-half walk back to my tent. As I trudged along the dark, lonely path, I started to sense I wasn't alone. I could hear the soft, calculated steps of something following me along the ridge. Glancing around, I could just make out the silhouette of a mountain lion stalking me, likely mistaking my slow, unsteady pace for weakness or injury. An easy meal. Fear gripped me, but I kept moving, pulling out my digital camera and using the flash to light up the darkness around me. I aimed toward the sound of movement, hoping the sudden bursts of light would keep the predator at bay. Thankfully, I made it back to my tent without incident. On another night, at a different campsite, I had an equally terrifying encounter. After a long shift at work, I probably smelled like a walking buffet, having worked a double at a busy restaurant. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the fatigue started to set in, and I was about to fall asleep when I heard loud crunches outside my tent. A black bear was sniffing around, drawn by the scent of food and sweat. Paralyzed with fear, I lay still, my heart pounding as the bear's snout pressed against the nylon tent, just inches above my head. The sensation of hot breath on my face was both surreal and terrifying. Instinctively, and probably foolishly, I slapped at the bear's nose through the tent. The unexpected contact startled the bear, causing it to retreat quickly. That close call was enough for me to realize that living out in the wild, especially with minimal protection, was too dangerous. Shortly after, I managed to secure an apartment with some friends, leaving behind the makeshift campsites and the nightly threats they harbored. Story 3. I've always been a big, intimidating guy, and because of that, the streets felt relatively safe to me. People tended to leave me alone, probably because I looked like someone you wouldn't want to mess with. But one day, something unexpected shattered my sense of security: a snowfall. It wasn't just any snowfall, it was the first of the year, and it came much earlier than I was prepared for. Seeing those delicate flakes falling from the sky, something normally so beautiful, made me break down in tears. Panic gripped me. I wasn't ready for winter, not even close. I had been clinging to the hope that I'd get back on my feet before the harsh cold set in. The snow, instead of being a picturesque scene, felt like a cruel reminder of my vulnerability. The beauty of it twisted into something terrifying, a harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead. Story 4. Honestly, that first night really outside, everything was terrifying. I had been homeless for about 4 months some years ago. Initially, I could stay with friends, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I would actually lie to them, telling them I had a place to go to. Luckily, in those 4 months, I only had to sleep outside for 2 weeks. The first frightening challenge was finding a place to sleep where people couldn't see me, and it was relatively dry. When I finally found places to sleep, it was a series of makeshift shelters. The first spot was in a park, nestled between some bushes. It felt like a small victory, finding a hidden corner where I could lay down. The second place was in a tiny playhouse in a public playground. It was cramped, but at least it offered some cover. The third was under a bridge, a place I thought would provide more shelter from the elements. But again, some nights I found myself back in the park between the bushes. Constantly, I worried about people seeing me. The fear of being discovered was a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Every single sound became a potential threat. A car driving by slowly made my heart race. Were they going to hurt me? The sounds of drunks singing in the distance were equally unsettling. If they saw me, I was sure they would screw around with me and be idiots. Another relentless challenge was the cold. I could only sleep very lightly for about 30 minutes at a time and would wake up shivering. At 19, I was 6 feet tall and weighed around 190 pounds, so I wasn't a small guy, but I was scared as hell. I couldn't help but think how much worse it must be for women in my situation. My best advice to anyone would be not to be an idiot like I was and just ask for help. Although it was extremely tempting, I didn't abuse drugs or alcohol. I didn't look homeless. I was just a big idiot thinking I could fix this by myself, not wanting to impose on people. I was 19 back then. Now, at 33, I'm happily married and have a nice home. Story 5. I was staying at a homeless shelter when a terrifying incident unfolded. One evening, a guy at the shelter was stabbed in the ribs by another resident. The attacker, showing no remorse or urgency, simply walked back inside and attempted to go to sleep. Meanwhile, the victim sat on a bench outside, blood spurting from his side, seemingly in shock. Despite his injuries, he stubbornly refused help, pushing away staff members who had called 911 and were trying to assist him. He even tried to light a cigarette, insisting he was fine, even as the life seeped out of him. Another incident at the shelter haunts me even more. There was a gas station down the street, and one day, a man filled a container with gasoline, walked back toward the shelter with a lighter in his hand, and doused himself in the fuel. He was clearly mentally ill, and at first, I didn't think much of it. I didn't smell gasoline or notice anything alarming as I smoked a cigarette outside. About 10 minutes later, while I was inside chatting at the front desk, someone burst through the door shouting for a wet towel, claiming that a man had set himself on fire across the street. Initially, I thought it was a prank or some exaggeration. But when I stepped outside, I saw the horrific scene, flames engulfing a stairwell. The shock hit me hard as I realized the severity of the situation. Together with a few others, we rushed to extinguish the flames. It wasn't easy. It seemed like the gasoline needed to burn off first, and the fire wouldn't go out. The chaos and panic blurred my memory, but I distinctly recall the man's anguished cries. "My balls! My balls are on fire! Put out my balls!" Despite our efforts, the man succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. I later learned that this wasn't his first attempt at such a tragic act. The shelter sent me to therapy afterward, and the therapist was incredibly supportive, helping me process the trauma. To this day, I struggle with the memory, especially the sight of someone on fire, which now triggers intense anxiety. The incident occurred around 2011 in Kentucky, and I've been slowly rebuilding my life since then. The last time I was homeless was in 2014. Although I still face financial challenges, I'm studying computer programming in my spare time, hoping to carve out a better future for myself. Story 6. I was 17 years old, fast asleep in the back of a car that belonged to my girlfriend's parents. It was the middle of winter in Canada, freezing cold, and around 3 a.m. I had crashed there after a long day, bundled up against the biting February chill in a parking garage. Suddenly, I was jolted awake, not by the cold, but by the sensation of being yanked out of the car. Police officers were dragging me out, treating me like a rag doll, as they shouted about a weapon. Still groggy and disoriented, I struggled to make sense of their accusations. At 6 to 2 inches and 210 pounds, I tried to explain that I had permission to be in the car and even provided them with the contact number for my girlfriend's parents. But they kept fixating on this supposed weapon, which baffled me. In my confusion and concern, I asked them to show me the weapon they were so worried about. The officers then pulled out a window scraper with a squeegee on one end, covered by a black garbage bag filled with clothes destined for goodwill. I couldn't believe it. They were acting like this common tool was some kind of threat. I asked them how they could possibly feel threatened by a squeegee, especially when I was clearly asleep when they arrived. Instead of addressing my concerns, they told me to shut up and loaded me into their car. They drove me to an all-night laundromat, of all places, and told me to sleep there, stretched across the uncomfortable plastic chairs. The whole situation felt surreal and frustrating. I was just trying to get some rest, not causing any trouble, yet I found myself being treated like a criminal. The experience left me with a deep-seated distrust of the police, as their actions seemed more about intimidation than protecting anyone. Story 7. I was 19 when I found myself homeless, wandering the streets with nothing but a few belongings. It was a rough few weeks, every night a battle to find a safe place to sleep. One evening, as the sun was setting and the city lights began to flicker on, I was approached by a man dressed as a priest. His appearance immediately put me on guard. I wasn't sure if he was truly a priest or just someone wearing the attire to deceive people like me. I have no interest in talking about God, I told him straight away, hoping to fend off any religious proselytizing, but his response was unexpected and has stuck with me ever since. I am not here to talk about God. I'm here to make sure you're safe. We talked for quite a while, his demeanor calming some of my initial wariness. As darkness enveloped the streets, he offered me a place to sleep for the night. Alarm bells rang in my head, but his sincerity convinced me to take a chance. He drove me to a suburban house, and after asking me to wait in the car, he returned with another man. This man offered me a spot in his garage for the night. The garage was typical: tools, a workbench, but in the corner was a box spring with some blankets. He explained that the connecting door to the house would be locked because he had kids inside and couldn't take any risks. The priest, after confirming he could come by in the morning, went inside with the man. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The kindness of strangers is a rare commodity on the streets, and every instinct I had told me to be wary. But nothing happened. The next morning, something remarkable occurred. The man knocked on his own garage door before entering. It might seem like a small gesture, but after living rough, having someone ask for permission to enter your space, however temporary or makeshift, was profoundly moving. It was a moment that restored a piece of my dignity. For 7 weeks, I stayed in that garage. Every day, the man and the priest would visit me, talk, and slowly help me piece my life back together. They found me a subsidized apartment, just a small studio, but it was mine, and even helped me secure a job. It's been over 20 years since then, and I still send Christmas cards to the man whose garage became my sanctuary. I even visited him for Thanksgiving a couple of years ago. The priest, sadly, passed away a few years back, but I'm certain that if there is a heaven, he found his place there quickly. Reflecting on this experience, I realize how fortunate I was to encounter such kindness. Not all stories from the streets end so well, and as we delve into more, we must brace ourselves for the darker tales. But this memory of strangers who became saviors remains a beacon of hope in my life. Story 8. One night, after having a meal at a local shelter, I decided to sleep in a park. The area was dangerous, especially at night, with other homeless individuals often robbing or attacking each other. Just a week earlier, someone had been knifed, and I knew I needed to leave. I opted to take alleyways, avoiding the drunks who would harass and assault the homeless. As I was making my way out, I heard a commotion. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. What I stumbled upon was horrifying. A man, naked from the waist down, was on top of what appeared to be an unconscious woman. His movements were animalistic, thrusting violently, and every few seconds, he would stop to throw a punch at her. She was completely limp and bloody, clearly in a horrific state. I shouted at him, and he turned to look at me. I've seen a lot of terrible things in my life, but the look in his eyes was beyond anything I had encountered. It was a mix of rage and insanity, his eyes glowing in the dim light from the street lamps. He was filthy, his face twisted into a terrifying expression. The sheer ferocity of his gaze scared me to my core. Overcome with fear, I ran to the nearest payphone and called 911. I couldn't bring myself to go back and check on the woman or confront the man. The memory of that night has haunted me, filling me with guilt for not doing more to help her. I often wonder what happened to her and whether the police arrived in time. While I felt like a coward for not intervening directly, I knew that confronting someone in such a feral state could have put my life in danger as well. I hope that she survived the ordeal and that the man was caught and punished for his actions. But the uncertainty and the knowledge that I couldn't do more to help have left a lasting mark on me. Story 9. I was homeless, but it wasn't a surprise. My husband and I had jobs and saw it coming, so we prepared. We had a minivan that we modified for survival, put our stuff in storage, and drove to his new job. We lived rough in the van while I ran my little telecommute business. Definitely not an MLM. Don't worry, I was homeless, not stupid. I also picked up a part-time night shift gig in retail to help guarantee a safe parking spot. 6 months of no rent, no utilities, and we managed to save up a decent down payment on a house. The most millennial thing ever, being secretly homeless. Kind of on purpose. We still saw some challenges, though. We called ourselves bougie homeless because my husband and I had white-collar jobs, and then I also had a blue-collar retail one. Eventually, he got a retail job too, not mentioning his other qualifications, and took the same weekend graveyard shifts I was on. We would stock shelves together purely to be indoors, someplace with lighting and able to talk. Not changing our last names to match turned out to be a good move. One manager suspected we might have a thing for one another and was very startled when we later purchased a house together and revealed we had been married for 5 years. Gym memberships were crucial for showering and exercise. Study rooms at libraries were great for quiet sleep if you knew how to use them. State parks offered good, restful sleep on nights when the store parking lot wouldn't cut it. The food options were pretty awful, but we learned to eat mainly from the produce section or to spring for stuff like trail mixes that didn't need refrigeration. They had a lot of protein and stuck with you pretty well. Excessive sodium was the enemy, making you thirsty and leading to restroom complications. I quickly learned I wasn't the only employee at the retail store who technically lived in the parking lot, at least intermittently. Nor was I the only regular customer. The homeless population wasn't the problem at all. It was the general poverty, lack of help for those trying, and lack of comfort for those suffering, other than the most toxic kind. That was the problem. I called an ambulance for a little kid whose mom wasn't moving in the bathroom. The kid was very calm about it, saying, "She probably just needs Narcan again, like how you have to plug in a phone sometimes." The mom's purse, a real one, cost more than a month in the house I had left behind for this bougie homeless adventure, yet her shoes were some of the cheapest our store sold. I wondered what her story was. A drug dealer caught a kid shoplifting and marched them back inside to return the stolen merchandise to me. Then he slapped the kid upside the head and offered me some weed on the house for being decent about the whole thing. I declined, thumping my chest and saying, "Asthma," but thanked him kindly for the offer. He was as polite as any neighbor ever after. There was often a car with very gaudy wheels parked not too far from the van. Once, walking back to the van late at night, I noticed footsteps matching my pace. Glancing back, I saw a middle-aged white guy suddenly get distracted by the occupants of the car with the gaudy wheels, one of whom was the pot dealer. I got into the van, told my husband to jump to the front and buckle up, and we drove to a different overnight spot. Pot dealers don't seem like bad sorts at all sometimes. We heard screams occasionally and learned quickly never to move the car if anything shady happened in the parking lot at night. The cops would look for witnesses, and if they thought you saw something and were leaving, you could be detained, which would blow our cover. On nights we heard crashes, screams, and swearing. We'd point the dash cam, click on the auxiliary battery, and go back to sleep until morning. Then we'd rotate the memory cards. If a cop asked, we'd say, "Our car was parked here, we can check the camera," thus maintaining plausible deniability about our homeless status. Our jobs at the store were our alibi. I kept both our real schedules and fake ones I'd put together on my laptop and printed at the library, with a little cornered dog ear code to indicate which was real and which wasn't. The constant changing schedules were perfectly believable to the cops, as was disorganized paperwork. It's a hell of a long commute sometimes. It's easier to just get here early and have a nap. Most likely, they knew we were bougie homeless, but bougie homeless people aren't a problem for cops as long as they stay invisible. They aren't a problem for anyone but themselves. Everyone. I'm kind of at my time limit here, and there's a lot more to this story, but I figured this was an okay place to stop. The bougie homeless thing is certainly an interesting strategy for saving money, and hey, we managed to buy a house with it, which is better than a lot of people can say right now, so I guess it works. Definitely doesn't seem for everyone, though. I don't know if I could rough it again. Story 10. One of the most harrowing experiences of my life happened when I was in a desperate situation, not truly homeless, but certainly without resources. After a violent altercation with my ex, who had almost strangled me to death, I was left with nothing. No money, no bank card, just a dying phone. The fight had happened while we were out, so I had none of my belongings, including my wallet. trying to get back to my parents, I managed to scrape together enough money for bus fare, but it wasn't enough to cover the entire journey. With no other options, I decided to hitchhike. As the night wore on and the streets became increasingly desolate, I realized I needed a place to rest. I found a barn and, seeing no other choice, slipped inside and tried to make myself comfortable enough to sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a loud cough and the sight of a shotgun barrel pointed directly at my face. The farmer who owned the barn had found me and, understandably, wasn't thrilled to see a stranger on his property. My heart raced, and I nearly lost control of my bowels from fear. He questioned me, asking how I'd gotten into the barn and what I was doing there. He even asked to see my arms, likely checking for any signs of drug use or violence. To my relief, after I explained my situation, the farmer's demeanor softened. He lowered the gun and started talking to me, his tone shifting from suspicion to concern. He ended up being quite kind, inviting me into his house. He offered me food, a shower, and a brief respite from the chaos that had engulfed my life. Looking back, I'm incredibly grateful for his good judgment and restraint. A less careful person might have panicked and pulled the trigger. It's moments like these that remind me how fragile and precious life can be. Story 11. The scariest thing I ever encountered on the streets was a man named Tony T. He had been a heavy drug user for years, maintaining a job just to support his habit. However, everything changed when he received a massive settlement of over $500,000. With that kind of money, Tony decided he never needed to work again. He took to living on the streets, smoking crack cocaine all day. The best way to describe him would be to compare him to Tuco from Breaking Bad, charismatic in a terrifying way, generous with his drugs, and dangerously unpredictable. Tony's generosity with his stash made him popular among other homeless individuals. People wanted to be around him to partake in the drugs he freely shared. But his unpredictable and violent behavior made him a walking powder keg. I have countless stories of his aggressive outbursts, but the last one I witnessed was the most terrifying. One day, a man accidentally dropped a small crack rock, probably worth around $20, into the dirt. Tony exploded in a fit of rage. He grabbed a pipe and began beating the man mercilessly. The severity of the attack was shocking. He might have killed the man, or at least seriously injured him for life. I tried to intervene, but Tony turned his wrath on me, threatening to do the same. I knew I had to get out of there. Shaken and terrified, I walked away, found a payphone, and called my sister. She came and helped me gather my belongings, and I left that life behind. That was over 30 years ago, but the memory of Tony and the chaos he brought into people's lives has stayed with me. It's a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of addiction and street life. Story 12. I had been homeless for a few weeks when I met this couple who seemed friendly enough, though that they had a drinking problem. We often hung out together, sharing what little we had. One night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard some commotion but couldn't make out what was happening. Suddenly, my friend sat down heavily on my sleeping bag. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Blood was spurting from his neck in sync with his heartbeat. Panicked, I asked him what had happened. He mumbled that he thought his girlfriend had cut his throat with a Stanley blade during a drunken altercation. Despite the severity of his wound, he was so intoxicated that he didn't fully grasp the danger he was in and insisted that I not call for help. Ignoring his protests, I called the police, who then called an ambulance. A couple of days later, I saw him again, still on the streets, but with a fresh scar on his neck. He was incredibly grateful and told me that the nurse had explained how lucky he was to be alive. The cut had come within millimeters of severing a major artery. The realization that he had been so close to death was sobering, a stark reminder of how precarious life on the streets can be. Story 13. This story isn't about something I saw, but something I heard. For a time, I slept in an abandoned warehouse, a massive Victorian-era building with about 6 floors. In the UK, these structures are not uncommon, and this one provided a sort of eerie shelter. I usually slept on the 3rd or 4th floor, away from casual intruders. The building was often frequented by drunks and escorts, which added an unsettling layer of unpredictability. One night, I was jolted awake by loud shouting and a woman screaming from the ground floor. At 16 years old, I was a junkie and weighed around 120 pounds. hardly in a position to intervene. Still, curiosity and concern drove me to sneak down the stairs to see what was happening. By the time I reached the ground floor, everything had fallen silent and the area was deserted. I returned upstairs, troubled by what I'd heard, but unsure what to do. The next day, I learned that a body had been found in the wasteland outside the warehouse. The woman had been an escort, and the police believed her client had stabbed her. They speculated that she had tried to escape, running from the building before he caught up to her and finished the job. The guilt and helplessness weighed heavily on me. I often wondered if there was something I could have done to help her. But realistically, given my state and size, I likely would have been another victim. The incident left a lasting mark on me, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of a life on the streets.